Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this year's Hisham Sharabi Memorial Symposium. My name is Muhammad. I'm the Executive Director here at the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center. And as always, it's a pleasure to welcome you all here online. Before we get started, I just would like to ask you to please continue to support us by watching these events. Please tell your friends and family about us. And if you can, please donate to the Jerusalem Fund and Palestine Center so that we can continue to put on events like this. Any support that you give is much appreciated. Today, we're very happy to host Michael Arria, Omar Baddar, and Lamis Deek, who will discuss their thoughts on how the new Biden administration will impact the future of Palestine, how Trump altered the right on the question of Israel, increasing support for Palestine among Democratic voters, and the current dynamics and politics on the ground in Palestine. I would also like to welcome Said Arikat, who will be moderating this discussion. So thank you all for joining us here today. So a little bit about our speakers. Michael Arria has covered foreign policy and social movements for the last decade, and he's the author of Medium Blue, The Politics of MSNBC. He's been the US correspondent at Mondawai since 2019. Omar Baddar is a political analyst, digital producer, and human rights advocate based in Washington, D.C. He serves as communications director for the Institute for Middle East Understanding, IMEU, and co-host for its podcast, This is Palestine. He previously served as deputy director of the Arab American Institute, a producer with Al Jazeera, executive director of the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts, and former director of the Palestine Cultural Center for Peace in Boston, Massachusetts. He holds a master's degree in political science with research focusing on US policy toward Palestine and Israel. He has participated in dozens of panels, lectures, and debates on college and university campuses throughout the US. His media appearances include the BBC, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, Sky News, Voice of America, and other outlets. And his writings have appeared in Salon, the HuffPost, the Daily Beast, and Jadaliya, among other platforms. Lamis Deek is a practicing human rights attorney and advocate whose work involves Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim civil rights and criminal defense matters, ranging from freedom of speech, assembly, and worship, to defense against state repression and predatory policing, surveillance and prosecutions, and manufactured terrorism cases. She defended against litigation campaigns to stop mosque construction and cases stemming from the unlawful and secret demographics unit, which she helped decode and represents those targeted for harassment and unlawful activity on campuses in the US and the UK. Lamis also specializes, by way of litigation, strategy and policy development in local, domestic, multi-jurisdictional, and international matters related to corruption, human and civil rights abuses, and complex civil and commercial matters. Lamis is a member of several Palestinian rights and liberation-focused organizations, advises numerous charities, and is a frequent lecturer on matters related to Palestine, militarization, and human rights. She is currently working to advance the growing international movement for accountability and interventions against war crimes in Palestine and the Middle East and North Africa region. Our moderator, Said Arikat, is a member of the Palestine Center Committee and the Washington Bureau Chief for the Palestinian newspaper Al-Quds, a daily for which he is a writer, columnist, and analyst. He previously served as spokesman and director of public information for the United Nations Assistance Mission for Iraq, and currently teaches as an adjunct professor at American University in Washington, D.C. So at the end of this discussion, we will have a Q&A session with the audience. You can ask your questions on the YouTube chat feature on the side, or you can tweet your questions to @Palestine Center. For any of you watching on Facebook, you can also post your messages there too. So without further ado, I'll pass it along to Said.
Okay, I'm turning on my speaker. Okay, welcome everybody. So we had just a little bit of echo. I want to welcome you all. And as Muhammad said, this is the annual Hisham Sharabi lecture. Of course, many people know Hisham. I mean, I We'll never forget the first time I met Dr. Hisham Sharabi in my freshman year in college, and he left an impact on me then and continued to do so. He authored 18 books. He taught at Georgetown University. One of his most famous students, I suppose, was President Bill Clinton. So he left his mark on this town in many ways, in terms of the history of the Middle East, the history of the Palestinians, and European history. So I want to welcome you all. We have a very rich topic to discuss today, or maybe multiple topics that are related with one another, and especially in view of what's going on the ground in Palestine today, in Jerusalem, with the canceling or postponing the Palestinian election, and of course how that really mesh or interjects with U.S. policy toward the Palestinian, taken of course in view and consideration the Israeli political logjam and mess. So without further ado, we go to you, Omar.
Thank you very much, Said, and to Muhammad and the Palestine Center for hosting this event, and obviously for my co-panelists, who I'm really excited to be sharing the stage with. I think it's important to start with what is currently unfolding real quick before we talk about the broader policy of what is unfolding in Jerusalem right now. As many people who might be following the story might already know, there's really an act of ethnic cleansing that is about to unfold in East Jerusalem, and really is part of a process that has been unfolding for a very long time, where Israel is deliberately changing the demographics of the city, trying to increase the Jewish population and decrease the Palestinian population in an effort to Judaize the city and cut off Palestinians from their legitimate rights in it. And what we're witnessing in Sheikh Jarrah right now is literally an attempt to throw Palestinians out of their homes in order for Jewish settlers to take over those very homes. That's what we're actually talking about. And it's really outrageous. And we're watching it unfolding with incredible brutality as we see Palestinians who are protesting on the streets of Jerusalem really being brutalized in hundreds of videos that are being spread all over social media. And had this situation been reversed, there is no question that this would be breaking news on just about every major outlet. If it was Israelis who are being brutalized in videos that are going viral everywhere. But somehow when it's Palestinians who are the victims, it seems like it's less worthy of attention. And that has to do with the fact that we're conditioned to accept the brutalization of Palestinians as just part of the normal discourse. And it's something that is really unacceptable and fundamentally needs to change. And to make things worse, we're also in an environment right now where, with the organization, by the way, which I'm not speaking on behalf of, I'm here in my personal capacity, but the Institute for Middle East Understanding now is tracking the fact that there are dozens of posts that people are posting about what's unfolding in Sheikh Jarrah that Instagram is now taking down. Palestinians have always been victims of censorship. We've always had to fight for our right to speak our minds and tell our story. But this is perhaps the most coordinated effort to suppress the Palestinian narrative on social media. And it's just really a sign of how difficult things continue to be, that even though we see signs of hope in different places, we also see the heavy hand of Israeli brutality on the ground and the heavy hand of censors among Israel's allies around the world working together to suppress our voices and our fight for our just future. When we talk about the Biden administration today, to draw a contrast between that and the Trump administration, I think it's important to remember what Trump was and what policy was before Trump. The US policy towards Palestine has for decades suffered from a fundamental problem, which is a hypocrisy, a contradiction between stated American policy and American action in practice. On the one hand, the United States has always been in favor of ending the occupation and opposed to settlements and respecting human rights and so on. But when it comes to American policy in action, it has consistently been unconditional military support for Israel and unconditional diplomatic protection at the United Nations, using its veto more than 40 times at the United Nations to shield Israel from accountability. And when Trump came along, he solved that hypocrisy, but he solved it in the wrong direction. Instead of changing American policy to match the lofty rhetoric that we often engage in, he changed American rhetoric to match the policy, and in fact escalated it, made it so much worse. He took the United States from a place where it was enabling Israel's violations of Palestinian rights to a place where the United States was full on supporting and waging the war against Palestinians alongside Netanyahu. So when Biden comes along, we see this as a shift in a positive direction in the sense that he undid some of Trump's worst policies and most monstrous policies. But he restored the pre-Trump normal, which was fundamentally broken in the first place. I mean, just when you think of one of the best things that the Biden administration did when they came into office, they restored funding to UNRWA. That's not a small thing. UNRWA is responsible for helping the most vulnerable Palestinians survive. And the fact that the Biden administration restored funding to them is not negligible. This is really makes the difference in the lives of vulnerable people, and that should be applauded and looked on positively. But at the same time, when you really think of it, why are the refugees in the first place that UNRWA is looking after? It is precisely because of Israel's oppression that the United States funds with billions of dollars. So we're in a situation where the United States is funding oppression with billions of dollars and then spending a few more million as a charity to the people who are suffering the oppression that the US itself is funding. And that really is the refrain that so many Palestinians have been repeating, is that ultimately Palestinians are not victims of some kind of natural disaster who are in need of charity. They are victims of oppression who are in need of freedom, and the United States is making that oppression possible and reinforcing it every single day. Now, if you're going to look for signs of hope, I don't think you can see them in the Biden administration itself. I don't think that Biden is particularly concerned about this issue. He doesn't want to expend any political capital on trying to resolve this issue. And when you compare him with other candidates who are running, even for the Democratic primary, there were more progressive voices in Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren who were floating the idea of holding Israel accountable. And Biden was the single most vociferous voice in response, insisting that Israel can never, that US military funding of Israel should never be conditioned on Israel behaving like a civilized nation and respecting human rights and international law. But where there are signs of change, I think they are in the fact that as Israel becomes more extreme on the ground, obviously that is incredibly depressing for the Palestinians who are living there and who are enduring that violence. That also is creating a public perception where it's becoming more and more difficult to defend Israeli behavior. And that's contributing to the public discourse shift here in the United States, where at this point you have a majority of Democrats, 64%, favor reducing American funding to Israel because of Israel's violations of Palestinian rights. That is a huge shift. And when you look at progressives in Congress right now who are speaking out against Israeli policies, that clearly was not the case 10 or 20 years ago at all. We're seeing a very significant shift. There was this mythology that the Israel lobby can never be crossed, and that if you ever dare criticize Israel, the Israel lobby will make sure that you have no political career or future in politics in America. And that's just now, that myth has been fundamentally proven to be a lie. You have people like Eliot Engel, who was the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee and one of the most powerful members of Congress supported by AIPAC. And he was thrown out of office and replaced by Jamal Bowman, a relative unknown, who was speaking out for Palestinian rights while running for that seat. That shift, I think, is very major. It's very drastic. It's very serious. And even though we are nowhere near the point where we need to be in terms of shifting America's policy and having more political figures who are in a position to actually influence policy in a meaningful way, being where they need to be, clearly we're at a point right now where the events that are unfolding in Sheikh Jarrah, despite the near media silence on it, you have now half a dozen members of Congress speaking out against it. These, I think, are the beginnings of an eventual shift that could come in American policy, the beginning of hope. And I see that there's definitely a roadmap by which, if we continue moving in the direction we're moving, and if our movement continues growing and shedding light on the injustice unfolding on the ground, we will be in a position to shift American policy. I'm just not particularly optimistic about the fact that we'll be able to get it done within the years of the Biden administration. And I'll just leave it at that.
Right. Okay, well, thank you, Omar. We will go to Michael. Go ahead, please.
Well, yes, first I wanted to thank you for moderating this, and obviously Jerusalem Fund for holding events like this during the pandemic. It's exciting to be on here with two great panelists. I was asked to speak about these issues and how they're currently playing out in U.S. politics. So I might echo some of the great points which have already been made. I should point out the Jerusalem Fund, they had asked when they first reached out to me what I thought about Trump's enduring legacy. I should point out I don't believe Trumpism's really going anywhere, but I think the jury's still out on that legacy in some ways, because I always think it's important to note that as soon as Trump was elected, he was met with resistance and protests. As I said, from the very moment he won. And I think his win radicalized many people and brought people to politics for the first time. We've obviously saw, the nation gripped by protests in the wake of the George Floyd murder by many metrics, the largest protest we've seen in this country. And as has been mentioned, Joe Biden was obviously, despite all this, elected as the Democratic nominee and then the president. And he was certainly one of the most right-wing candidates running in the primary, and very right-wing as it relates to our beat. Refers to himself as a Zionist, brags about his friendship with Netanyahu. But I think what's interesting is that if we look at exit polls during the primary, we see that a majority of Democratic voters support policies that are to the left of Biden, certainly domestic, but also when we talk about foreign policy, when we talk about our beat at Mondowai. So I'll give you just one recent example. Every year, Gallup releases polling on American attitudes towards the conflict, and their latest report just came out, I think, about a month ago. And we saw something very notable in the results. For the first time since they began tracking this information, a majority of Democratic voters said that the United States should apply political pressure on Israel, not Palestine, to bring about peace. 53% of Democrats said the pressure should be put on Israel. And just to show how much that number has jumped in recent years, in 2018, it was 43%. A decade ago, it was 38%. So that's a really historic poll, but I also don't think it's a surprise to people who have been following these issues in terms of polling. For instance, in 2019, there was a Data for Progress poll that found 65% of Democratic voters support conditioning aid to Israel. A Center for American Progress poll from the same year had that number as high as 71%. There was even a poll by the University of Maryland last year, which found that 49% of Democrats had heard of the BDS movement. And of those who had heard of it, 48% said that they strongly or somewhat support it. So I think we're really seeing opinions shift among Democratic voters, and which begs the question, what's behind this development? And insofar as this stuff gets covered by the mainstream media, I think there's a tendency to focus on the stuff that politicians do, which is obviously part of what we cover too, whether it's Betty McCollum's historic new bill or Elon Omar's boycott bill, or all the lawmakers who have criticized Israel's vaccine policies, or the recent events that we've seen in East Jerusalem over the past week. The amount of Congress members who address these issues is still very small, but the polling shows us that they're acting with the support of their actual base. And it's the vast majority of Democratic officials who are out of step with the people who vote for them. And I think that the real credit here is, of course, it lies, as it does with pretty much every issue, with activists, with people on the ground across the world who have fought for Palestine to be free. And we've seen in recent years more attempts to stifle and censor Palestinian activists, as has already been mentioned, from pro-Israel organizations, students, lawmakers, big tech companies like Facebook and Instagram. Every year, the group Palestine Legal puts out a report detailing the work that it does. Its 2020 report recently came out, and they identified 213 incidents of suppression of US-based Palestine advocacy. 80% of those incidents involve students and scholars. And despite the fact that last year, I think most people would have expected their local officials to focus on the pandemic, there are 21 legislative measures introduced last year cracking down on Palestinian rights or the BDS movement more generally. And under the Trump administration, I think we really saw that kind of stuff ramp up, especially in college campuses. We saw former Education Secretary Betsy DeVos even threaten to pull funding from universities if they didn't get their programs into line. We saw the Trump administration's top civil rights enforcer, Kenneth Marcus, welcome civil rights complaints from the Israel lobby. And although I don't expect the same level of aggressiveness when it comes to some of the stuff from Biden, I think it's important to remember that from the moment it began, BDS was condemned and derided, not just by conservatives, but by Democrats and liberals. And the line from many at the time was that BDS was an irrelevant, esoteric movement that couldn't have much of an impact. But all these years later, we see these constant attempts to attack it and even outlaw it, which begs the question, if it's having no impact and there's no chance of it becoming vastly popular, then why have pro-Israel groups and lawmakers stepped up their efforts to try to stop it? And I think, from my perspective, there's been a real nervousness and concern among pro-Israel groups when it comes to this activism becoming bigger and bolder and having a real impact on public opinion in this country. And if you take a group like Democratic Majority for Israel, an organization that we cover a lot at the site, this is a lobbying group that was established a couple years ago by Democratic donors and insiders. I think they see themselves as a hipper, like less stodgy version of AIPAC maybe. A bunch of them are actually AIPAC alumni, but their big claim is that the vast majority of Democrats support Israel. It's in their very name. But if you look at them as a lobbying group, their two biggest efforts of the last couple of years, one of which was already mentioned, the first one, the attempt to save Elliot Engel's seat in New York, and the second one to help defeat Bernie Sanders in the primaries. In the case of Engel, I think he really symbolized everything the group is about, and he symbolized the views that they insist are quite popular among Democratic voters. He was obviously a very hawkish pro-Israel Democrat who opposed his own party and former president when it came to the Iran deal. He'd been in power since the 80s, so he was obviously a very entrenched figure in that district. And his progressive opponent, Jamal Bowman, represented something different on the issue. He supported conditioning aid to Israel, said he supported Betty McCollum's historic child detention bill. I think DMFI spent $2 million trying to stop Bowman, and they failed, obviously, and voters ousted Engel. In the case of Sanders, he, of course, didn't win the nomination, but DMFI actually sent out an email after he lost claiming some level of credit for him dropping out of the race. What's interesting is that I believe they spent something like $700,000 running these attack ads on Sanders, which played before the Iowa caucus. And in them, they never actually mention Israel or Palestine. They have these people or actors say that they're concerned that Bernie won't be able to beat Trump. They're concerned about his health, but they never actually mention foreign policy at all. So here's this group whose entire existence is predicated on this idea that support for Israel is rock solid among the vast majority of Democrats, and a couple $1 million can't save a guy who represents everything they believe in. And they won't even mention Israel, the country that they lobby for, in an attack ad, even though they claim it's such a slam dunk position. So I think it's very clear why a group like DMFI was created, regardless of what they claim. I think they were created to stomp out a growing sympathy for the Palestinian cause among progressives. And it's not just polling that shows us that they have valid reasons to be concerned. If you look at something like AOC backing out of an event honoring late former Israeli Prime Minister Rabin last fall, an annual thing that many liberals and progressives have attended, she was set to give a talk, obviously over Zoom. Palestinians, there was a real backlash, particularly from Palestinians on Twitter. And she ultimately decided not to go. She was forced to listen to them, effectively pressured by Palestinians. And groups like DMFI really lost their minds over the fact that this occurred. So in addition to that, I don't think they're just concerned about the growing success of Palestine activism, although that's obviously a huge part of their anxiety. I think on some level, a lot of these organizations understand that people, maybe even people who don't pay close attention to politics, are beginning to realize how ridiculous the political consensus is on this issue, and that just saying, or Democrats just saying that they're against the occupation and support a two-state solution is no longer cutting it for many voters or progressives. You don't have to be like an astute expert of the Middle East to look at the position of most Democrats and see that they don't add up at all. Andrew Yang's running for mayor of NYC, of course, and he's faced real pushback for his anti-BDS stance, which has been all over the place in some respects. But a few weeks ago, he had a really amazing quote, which I took note of. He said that his problem with the BDS movement was that it targeted Israel, which is just an amazing comment. This is a nonviolent movement that's effectively trying to get Israel to honor its obligations under international law. And one wonders how a movement like that could make this happen without targeting the actual country. But you apply those same contradictions to the Biden administration, as has already been mentioned. There's been the usual rhetoric about two states, rhetoric about living in peace, both sides feeling secure. But during his campaign, his website declared that BDS was anti-Semitic, said that it let Palestinians off the hook for their poor choices, whatever that means. Secretary of State Tony Blinken says the administration supports the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism, which includes some criticisms of Israel. They say they oppose the ICC investigation into alleged Israeli war crimes. They're not going to reverse Trump's embassy move, obviously. And as has already been mentioned, Biden has repeatedly referred to conditioning aid to Israel as a gigantic mistake. So again, even if you're just a casual observer of this stuff, you see the position of Biden. Palestinians can't be violent. They can't join a nonviolent boycott movement. They can't take legal action against the people oppressing them. They can't hope for many of Trump's policies to be reversed in the region. And they can't expect the United States to stop funding the occupation or the violence that's carried out against them. And I think people see a state that's operating with absolutely no consequences. The US is trying, or might be trying, it's unclear, to resurrect the Iran deal, which is in shambles because the US government violated it, of course. The first week that the two sides meet, an Iranian uranium enrichment facility is attacked. And I think, if you have a basic understanding of how the world works, it was Israel who was responsible for this. So Iran's attacked, embarrassed on the world stage during this important moment for them. They predictably announced that they're going to enrich even more uranium in response to the attack, which prompts all kinds of denunciations from the Biden administration, who question whether Iran is serious about the Iran deal to begin with. But there was a funny moment when one of their spokespeople was going through this whole song and dance about Iran's lack of seriousness, and they were asked directly whether the president was going to ask Israel to refrain from attacking Iran while he was trying to negotiate with them. And what's amazing, of course, is that the spokesperson couldn't even publicly admit that Israel was responsible for the attack, which, they're clearly trying to torpedo those deals the same way they were when Obama was president. So I think people see things like this and they realize it makes no sense on its face. And I think that they see these contradictions heightened more and more. And I think they see the growing popularity and impact of movements like BDS. And I think the other, just quickly, component here is the fracturing of the liberal Zionist consensus on this issue, which is a topic that Phil Wise covers at our site quite often. This terrain is obviously going to get rockier and more complicated in the coming months and years. We just saw J Street, a pro-Israel group, endorse the new Betty McCollum bill. We saw that recent Human Rights Watch report referring to the situation as apartheid. So I think there's an open question about what this all means going forward and how it gets navigated, because something else we've noticed is that Trump has really created some space for right-wing politicians to be bolder. And, it's standard for lawmakers to go on these IPAC financed trips to Israel and come back talking about how great Iron Dome is and all this kind of stuff. But there's often some vague nod to a two-state solution. And something that we noticed during the Trump years was that, for instance, there was a trip like that in 2019, and a bunch of Republicans came back and were effectively openly saying that Israel should annex the entire region. So like Phil Rowe from Tennessee came back and said, it said that Jerusalem had been under, quote, Palestinian rule until 1947. Representative Ann Wagner from Missouri did an interview where she openly said that things had changed while Trump was president for her, that her position on the two-state solution was evolving. But of course, when she says that it's evolving, she doesn't mean, she's going to write a piece for Jewish Currents about how she supports one big democratic country now. She obviously means she wants Israel to take control of everything. So at the site, we're obviously interested in how these lawmakers act on both sides going forward, not just at the local level, but how they're pressured and forced to engage with this kind of stuff. Because as I said, I think the popularity of the Palestinian cause continues to grow among the population, and I don't see any reason to believe that that is about to stop. But once again, I'd like to thank the panel and the organizers of the event, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about all this.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael. And now, Lamis.
Hi. Oh, sorry. Hi.
Now
thank you
I
for
see
those
you.
great
Okay.
interventions. Yeah, my numerous devices. Thank you for those brilliant interventions, Michael and Omar. You touched on really critical points, and I'm grateful for that. I'll add to that. My segment will focus more on what's happening in Palestine, and then maybe close back with some thoughts on the trajectory of political organizing in the U.S. To start where Omar also started, what we see in Sheikh Jarrah and Al-Quds, especially on the 73rd annual, I don't want to call it, anniversary, the 73rd annual commemoration of al-Nakba, is that Sheikh Jarrah is the crystallized, concentrated, physical, social media accessible manifestation of one tiny part of the Nakba, and of course an ongoing testament of the ongoing nature of the Nakba. Whereas in Palestine from the 1930s throughout the 1950s and the 1948 territories, that Nakba was under Zionist guns, as it is still now. Sheikh Jarrah is happening by quote unquote legal orders, and the timeline has continued. The people living in Sheikh Jarrah are survivors of pre and post Nakba. They come from Haifa and Yafa, and this is just another stage in the Israeli march to cement and expand Zionist and Israeli colonization of Palestinians. So Sheikh Jarrah is not distinct in that it is not different than what's currently happening in Gaza against the people of Khan Yunis, for example, or against the people in Aqraba or in Bir al-Saba, right? So it's just the concentrated manifestation and the honest articulation and participation, the visible participation of settlers, which also have to be examined as we organize on Capitol Hill and addressed in all facets of our organization. All of this comes in the context of really a global crisis, but a regional crisis that has left Palestinians under and decreasingly supported both materially and politically within the region within which they exist, and with a show of increased material and political and legal support from the region for Israel and expansion. We talk about it's wild to me that still the two-state narrative or the Israeli narrative or even any of the Israeli constructs and language are still alive. What Sheikh Jarrah and what's happening in Burin and in Gaza is clear politics, clear practices of ethnic cleansing and genocide, because there is clear express articulation of intent, and intent is the hallmark legally of the element of the crime of genocide from Israelis. Everything from the quote unquote little Shoah to the mowing the lawn to what we're seeing in Sheikh Jarrah, regardless of the tools and the artificial labeling by Israelis and Zionists and their allies and supporters, liberal Zionists and otherwise. The role of the Nakba commemoration and what we're witnessing now and what's being asked of us is to call it for what it is in all of what we're doing, even in the way that we speak and write about it. Also missing, and I think what's really important, and it's not sufficiently, and this is a critical point, not sufficiently addressed, and there's actually some strategic reasons that Palestinians on the ground don't address it, is the role that Palestinians from the 1948 territories, and I'm not talking about Quds-related Palestine 1948 areas, but from across the Palestinian 1948 territories who are called Israeli citizens, quote unquote, or Arab Israel, their role and the level and the extent of their organically coordinated participation in the armed and physical resistance of the ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah, but also consistently in defense of Al-Aqsa and in defense of Al-Quds generally. This is very critical because we've been seeing an escalation. This has not stopped. The Palestinian 1948 objection and protests to Israeli colonization in the 48 areas and their bombardments and attacks in the West Bank and Gaza have never stopped. But what we're seeing, what we're witnessing is an increased physical express articulation and participation in the resistance. And this speaks volumes. And we consider this in the context, first, that this is organically happening. There isn't a centralized mechanism of coordination between the people in 48 and between the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah or in Nablus or in Gaza whatsoever. And their participation is not just a rejection of their status كإسرائيلية as Israelis in the 1948 areas, but it's a rejection of their physical and political fragmentation from the Palestinian body as a whole. So the enhanced but always constant participation of Palestinians is therefore a declaration and a reaffirmation of their joint demands for full liberation, for return, and equally important, defines the boundaries to which the Palestinian demands, physically defines them as they are in the 1948 areas, the survivors of the highest round of ethnic cleansing, defines the boundaries to which those demands for liberation and return are happening. Wahda Wataniyya to all of the Watan and not just the West Bank and Gaza. And this is very critical. This is the organic reunification in practice and physical corporal action, despite brute Israeli violence against that, despite administrative and political Israeli obstacles to this. And it's a rejection of everything that we've seen, not just since 1948, but especially that we've seen since Oslo, and everything that the PA has done in coordination and collaboration and service of Israel, which is to say we reject the definition of the Palestinian body as that reserved, that tiny fraction of the Palestinian people reserved to the West Bank and Gaza. Again, so once the central political institution, i.e. the PLO, which was anointed to represent and support Palestinians from the 1948 territories to the West Bank, to Gaza, to Palestinians here in the US and in the refugee camps in Syria and Lebanon and across the world, was subsumed and supplanted by the Palestinian Authority in an effort to further actively fragment our people physically and politically. This is being rejected. But this Oslo and its progeny that we're seeing now was not, even as the late great Edward Said said, a tool of surrender. It was rather a weapon of war. And I think it's important, especially for Palestinians and our allies who are addressing and analyzing what went wrong, what do we need to do better, what mistakes we need to make, because I think it's incumbent upon us, especially in the United States, Palestinians and those invested, to make honest, right, active, intellectual analyses, right, to create new strategies that are effective, be honest about what's failed, and to admit that Oslo was not just a tool of surrender and a mistake, but it was a joint vested project to divert and destroy collective Palestinian democratic will and capacity for mass organization and self-defense. Oslo and the attendant PA and NGOization of Palestine diverted resources that Palestinians once had, diverted and destroyed resources that Palestinians once had to collectively survive and thrive despite Israeli violence, and to be able to resist it, from collective equitable distribution of those resources to those resources going into the pockets and the NGOs and corrupt officials on conditions of cooperation and facilitation, and on condition of criminalization of Palestinians globally and physical arrest of Palestinians objecting to their own oppression inside Palestine. It diverted Palestinians away from models of self and communal and land-based sustenance to dependency on offices in Ramallah and New York and DC. Diverted Palestinians away from each other physically and culturally and socially by actively excluding and taking away our capacity to coordinate, to speak, to meet by ballot and by convening. Divided land, divided people, for the age-old smartest tool, put in an even smarter framework called Oslo for the old divide and conquer, supported by the world's greatest powers. So not only was Oslo just a diversion, but it was a campaign and a tool to destroy Palestinian capacity to survive, right? And therefore, it is an agent and a tool of Palestinian ethnic cleansing and genocide. And this must be the starting point to understanding and thinking about how we relate and how we discuss the so-called Palestinian elections. I mean, in what world can we, just as we can't call or have justice from our colonizers, in what world can we imagine that we can have democracy under colonization? And in this context, what we're seeing is clearly a liquidation almost of the legitimacy of the Palestinian Authority at this point. And that's why I think the primary reason why we're seeing the postponement of the elections, it happens to come at an opportune moment. You know, we saw that after 6 years after the Intifada And I remind us again that the Intifada in September of 2000 happened specifically and expressly in rejection of Oslo and everything that came after Oslo, with great price and great sacrifice from September 2000 until, depending on who you ask, 2004, 2006. And in the 2006 elections, right, when we talk about elections happening now, and the decreased, not just popularity, but the rejection of the Palestinian Authority, and Mahmoud Abbas is a leg of the Palestinian Authority, and Fatah, we remember, and we have to remember, what was the response to when Palestinians did in fact speak and act democratically in 2006 and made the call for full self-preemptive defense, i.e. resistance, protected and supposed to be protected and afforded them by law and by international duty. When they made the vote to protect themselves and to survive and to reject Oslo and to call for a return and to call for resistance, what they were met with was brute violence, repeated massacres, not just families, but entire clans murdered within minutes. This was the Israeli, US, European supported response to Palestinian electoral democratic will and articulation of their aspirations. Massacres and murder, and now a concentration camp where we have people placed on calorie restrictions and murdered every day, their crops poisoned. So this is the response. And in what context do we have elections, and who would we be allowed to survive electing, and who is being allowed to vote? Where is the voice of the Palestinian refugees? UNRWA certainly has served an important service function, but this has also been detrimental in that UNRWA came to somehow subsume and speak for the political will, a will that also somehow appeared to render Palestinians as mere subjects, right? As mere subjects of charity. Even the UNRWA educational system is conditioned on a certain narrative and framework of Palestinian teaching of history, a curriculum, a curriculum about how Palestine can be taught. So there's no representation for the Palestinian refugees other than their existence in the UN as UNRWA. Nobody speaks for them. The delay and the placing of the right of refugees to return in the Oslo Accords was a liquidation, right? And it was an erasure of the majority of the Palestinian people. So in this context, what could one say about the elections now? What elections, right? Elections are rhetoric. Elections on what basis, and elections for who? There have been hundreds of meetings, in the past few years, attempting to revive or to create or to establish unity between the leadership of the Palestinian factions. But again, in this context, when you have a body or a segment of a body or a segment of an institution directly invested, and I don't mean invested just systematically or as a political institution, but if you look at the individuals who are making the ultimate decisions in this, they are, by corruption, personally invested in the survival and thriving of Israeli and Zionist institutions, financial and political and otherwise, because they receive direct benefit. So when we say Palestinian elections, of whom and including whom and for what end, and when we say Palestinian unity, we have to ask Palestinian unity on what value basis, which brings us back to the polls. Palestinians have spoken from 2006, from 1948, to be honest, in whom they elected in 2006, and in the polls now, which underlie the reason for the postponement of the elections, who and what they want, from the polls to the protests, from the composition of who is protesting on the ground in Palestine, to who is polling for which party and which agenda in the elections. Michael raised a critical point that I think we take too often for granted. I've been heavily involved with the Arria work, and I have actually a number of cases in the UK specifically around this. It's unfortunate that I feel, and I've struggled myself, and I make no criticism because I understand how hard it is. First, it's important to understand how well coordinated globally the weaponized, the military campaign, the expansion of the colonization, the genocide is on the ground with the international, legal, political, even administrative war of repression against Palestinians and their allies. Of course, a glaring example of this is what happened with the Labour Party in the UK, and there's no shortage of examples here. And I raise this to raise the importance of us when we talk about the strength of unity. I've said often, and I say again, that unity, which is our capacity to mass organize on an agreed upon express basis, on agreed upon express demands from which we do not divert, from which we do not compromise. This is the basis of mass organization, and mass organization has been the hallmark of every moment of strength in the Palestinian struggle for liberation. And so as we watch them coordinate, I worry and I ask and I work on ensuring that as we engage, especially in policy work, that we are honest, that the mistakes that were made were not an honest assessment of realpolitik. They were not working simply within, oh, what do we think we can get, but rather still working within the Israeli framework and also erasing the gamut of Palestinian demands and the borders, the extent of Palestinian demands, and the strategies of asking for mere fractions of what we are entitled to, of mere fractions of what the Palestinian people, all of them from the refugee camps in Lebanon to Gaza, are asking for, has failed. And when I say again, the basics of negotiation 101 is you ask for more than you are entitled to, you let your adversary decline all that they do, you take the gains and you appeal. And in that appeal and restatement and reaffirmation of the right to return and of reparations and of restitution, you are building and rebuilding the narrative. And we have to be honest, for 20 years, I'm a member of Al-Auda and many other organizations. For 20 years, the policy makers or those advocating and well-funded, on DC, made fun of, in the least, demonized, marginalized, red-baited those of us who were calling for Palestinian right to return. 40 years people sat in Ramallah and in DC, pockets well-lined, alhamdulillah, and didn't make the same progress that our people made within 40 days protesting on the front lines of the concentration camp that has been made of Gaza. And so these same people, these same institutions were readily wielding the images, right? The images that were making the case for the work that they were doing. The images of the freedom fighters and the children and the men and the women and the elders and the medical workers who were murdered, wielding those images and still not making strategic political demands, policies, not developing policies specifically for Palestinian right to return. And it's not, and what baffles me and what I'm worried about is that these demands don't, they're not an anomaly. They are based in historic legal precedent. You look at the case of South Africa. South Africa reached back 80 years for reparations. You look at the case of Algeria. They said, okay, you make amends, you agree to these new laws, you move a few houses down, you let our people come back into their original homes, and we're one and done. And those who wanted that state, there's no objective, intellectual, real, rational reason to not make these demands, take what we can get and keep going. And so I want to stress this point, especially on the anniversary of Al-Nakba. The strategies of asking for fractions, for crumbs, has failed. Let us be honest about this. This has to be the assessment in part of our realpolitik approach to things and understand what works. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's why all you three make such profound statements and profound points and so on, because you are well versed in these topics that you tackle. So, that's why I'm always awestruck and inspired to see Omar's videos, for instance, such compact and so on, and they make such an impact. Or Aman Dawais's effort, or Lamis's, legal but passionate and very inspiring political observation. So I thank you all. I mean, one, and that is really posed to all three of you. One would be really cynical, not to acknowledge the shift, incremental as it is, and in the narrative, at least, among American politicians and American, personalities and so on. After all, I think America's top spook, the former top spook, John Brennan, the former CIA director, spoke basically, in a way, I mean, albeit very, indirectly condemning the Israeli actions against the Palestinians and talking about the need to do that. That yesterday there were statements made on Twitter by Congresswoman Newman, Marianne Newman from Illinois, and Congressman Garcia, also from Illinois, calling on the State Department, to not to look the other way or to take action on the ethnic cleansing that is taking place. I mean, even the State Department yesterday, for the first time, when they were asked about the marauding settlers burning Palestinian crops, she basically said, the spokeswoman said, that we urge the Israelis not to take unilateral action, without saying, the Palestinians, which is always a thing here. The Palestinians also are urged not to take unilateral action. But in fact, and that's really what I wanted to pose to all of you. In fact, not much progress has made. I mean, we look at the so-called Democratic majority for Congress, and there are very powerful people in the administration. Like, I don't want to mention names, but I would just once, like Granholm, who is the Secretary of Energy. She was a front for the Israeli lobby in many ways, and so on, and many, many others. They are all across the different departments of the administration in Congress and everywhere. And the progress that should be made is not made. I mean, American intellectual leadership and scholars and so on from all walks and backgrounds, walks of life and backgrounds, and really have not taken the sort of the human obligation, if you will, that, let's say, was taken during the anti-war movement or during apartheid South Africa and so on. I assume that is really happening. I want to ask all three of you, how can you basically generate the kind of activism, and as Lamis pointed out, she said that basically an ounce of activism is better than a pound of advocacy, so to speak. I mean, citing what is happening in Gaza and some of the marches and all these things, especially at the where and what groups ought to be mobilized. In fact, not only urged, but basically, demanded of, and pushed and so on, and showing them why they should be out there actively, not only advocating, but actively demanding things can be changed. And I'm not at all, all that optimistic about the current, the role of the current administration. Thank you.
You're muted.
Yeah, I mean, I am, so Omar and Lamis and Michael, I'd like you to take a crack at this.
Lamis, do you want to go first?
I just finished talking, so I'll take a break and go after.
Sure. I'm happy to take a stab at this. So on the one hand, I totally hear you, Said. I think that there has been absolutely tremendous progress that has been made. And the question is always, how do you tip it over into becoming a meaningful influence on policy? And unfortunately, there isn't a shortcut to this. I think that this is the kind of thing that ends up building over a very long time, where there is, shifting public opinion is one thing, but public opinion does not necessarily impact public policy immediately. And this is not just on the issue of Palestine. There's a wide range of issues in which the American public is far more progressive than the political leadership, whether it comes to the climate or about a billion other things. And that's always a fun, it's I think an issue that a lot of people tackle with across many, many different causes, about how to narrow how to channel public opinion on a particular issue into effective advocacy. And you don't really need a majority of people to do that. You need a minority of active people to really get things done. And you see it in the fact that there are so many smaller, more politically active, engaged groups who shift policy in a direction that is not necessarily reflective of what the general public wants. And in this case, I think that most of the work, and I think correctly, is still focused primarily on fundamentally shifting public discourse before we start narrowing it to really shifting policy. Because the forces that we have, like when you look at the way that Congress looks right now, the overwhelming majority of Democrats in Congress, despite the fact that their party, as a base, when you look at public polling, is in support of shifting American policy, in support of justice, and away for support for apartheid, the majority of Democrats in Congress are not where they need to be, because they're still stuck in an old mindset where they're more concerned about, small lobbies and donors and things of that sort, rather than doing the right thing, even though they know the majority of the public actually supports shifting their policy, because ultimately the people who support shifting policy, this is not a decisive voting issue for them. So just because the majority of Democrats want to withhold aid from Israel or reduce it because of Israeli violations of human rights, does not mean that a president who's not willing to do this would not get their vote. And what I think what we need to focus on is emphasizing the absolute urgency of the situation. And I think this is where we go. For me, it's a point of emphasis on the fact that this is really apartheid, and the fact that the Human Rights Watch report came out is incredibly significant. I know a lot of people are dismissive of the facts, given the fact that a lot of people before them have said that it was apartheid, and it hasn't made much difference. But I think that for an organization like Human Rights Watch, which is mainstream, credible, and frankly, even on the cautious conservative side compared to, say, Amnesty International, I think Amnesty International is a more activisty, slightly more progressive, and willing to, put themselves out there in making certain statements. I think the fact that Human Rights Watch stuck their neck out and used the A word is really significant. And they're sticking to their guns, and they've broken it down, and they've provided a mountain of evidence, right? It's not just a willingness to say the word, but to provide a level of evidence that would make it impossible for anybody to disagree with. And I think that that's the kind of analogy that we have to make for people to fully understand that the United States is literally supporting Jim Crow-like policies somewhere else. The fact that we are directly responsible for it, the fact that it would not be possible without our support, and to build that sense of moral imperative for the average person to see this as a decisive moral issue on which that they should cast their votes. And frankly, when I look back at the protests that happened in 2014, when Israel was slaughtering hundreds of children in Gaza, spontaneously, there were thousands of people who turned up in front of the White House demanding that the US intervene and put restrictions on Israeli behavior. So I see that we are moving in a direction that is positive. I'm fairly confident in the fact that we are moving in the right direction. I'm not particularly confident about the time frame in which we will be able to shift policy, but I do think that we are building the alliances on the grassroots level with other movements, with the Black Lives Matter movement, with a series of organizations that are demanding a fundamentally different kind of world, and Palestine is absolutely part of that picture. And I think that as these organizations and forces start making a little bit more progress in our society, we're going to see Palestine be part of that wave and ultimately get to a point where we shift policy. It's just probably not going to happen under President Biden.
Mike?
Yeah, I wanted to maybe add a little something in terms of something that I've noticed in covering the activism, a strategy that seems to be strengthening a bit more. I remember in 2019, many activists, like Jewish Voice for Peace and some others, would go to town halls with Democratic lawmakers who had condemned Trump's border policies of child detention, policies of separating families at the border, and then would ask the politicians why they could be against it domestically, but then obviously these lawmakers had not signed on to Betty McCollum's child detention bill. And drawing the contrast there, I think that is an interesting frame kind of going forward. Shortly after Betty McCollum's new bill came out, it seemingly at the same time, this AIPAC promoted letter came out that was signed by so many Democrats, many more than obviously signed on for McCollum's bill. And one of the people who signed it was Ro Khanna, who has been a symbol of really progressive foreign policy when it comes to so many issues, and has spearheaded the campaign. The War Powers Act, which was obviously vetoed by Trump, but I think I can't think of a House member who's fought more aggressively for an end to the war in Yemen than Ro Khanna, and yet he signed this AIPAC letter. So
yeah,
it's interesting just going forward, kind of highlighting those contradictions. I think when we see what's referred to often as progressive accept Palestine. How lawmakers can be so good on so many issues, even foreign policy issues now. There's space to do it, but there's still, for many, still that disconnect when it comes to Israel. So that's something that I'm interested in going forward, and how kind of activists draw attention to that and exploit it.
I mean,
yeah. So loath as I am to even remotely disagree or draw distinctions between what you said and I said, Said, is, I wanted to clarify that it's not so much to say that advocacy versus activism. And I'll come back to that in a second, but I do want to underscore the fact that the space that we're seeing in US and American discourse and media, and even from the mouths of politicians, is actually not new. This has happened before in the US, and it's important that we understand why it was limited, how it was limited, and to understand what we all know, which is the military, financial, global interest that the US has in Palestine specifically, and the need for domination of Palestine historically, which goes back to hundreds of years of colonization of Palestinians because of the geomilitary strategic position we happen to exist in. And this should make us, my concern really, is this should make us, let me start again, because I want to go a step back. This should make us consider the mistakes that we have made in understanding, articulating, and predicting the next Israeli or US or imperial tactic to be used in the domination of Palestine. And as far removed as that feels from how we craft our policies, right? Legislative and legal and all of this, or otherwise, it is not actually. And this is what I was trying to underscore, is that our inability, in part for being responsive and constantly responding to crisis. And I'm going to say, in this past week, I've worked an average of 17 to 20 hours a day just reacting to the crises that are happening, whether on the ground in Palestine or in the UK or here in the US. It's exhausting. But we are poised as people in the US, and especially our allies. My cousin, 16 years old, Said Odi, was my cousin. I just realized yesterday. Before this, we're dealing with how many murdered yesterday. So we're constant. So our allies and those who are funded and paid need to make these material connections that often sound like we're talking about activism, but the activism and this quote unquote activist rhetoric is actually the material and the historic reality that articulates and should link what is gonna happen next. How do we preempt it? And how do we make sure that activism, not just by us here, but activism with blood and with life and with physical sacrifice on the ground in Palestine is not needed in the future? Meaning, I'm not saying, the idea that, sophistication and the timing and all of this is important, but this needs to calculate the material connections between all of this and how this in many ways has not been effective. Meaning, when we go for policy, and I do policy work as well, Ustazi. So when we go in for policy and we talk to officials who say, oh yes, absolutely, we hate your people, we love Zionism, long live Israel, I say, mush mushkili, you hate them, this is what's going in my brief. These are the demands that I'm making, all of them. Give me some. Give me some. And this normalization of the full gamut of demands by all Palestinians in the US and on the ground in Palestine and the refugee camps does get normalized by policy maneuvers, which is distinct from the DCI bill. It's a brilliant bill. It doesn't make any compromises, right? And what concerns me is as the door is opening, that people, I grew up in a United States where my teacher literally forged my report card when I was in school as a child because I said I was Palestinian. That we're so excited having come up from this history that the doors of City Hall in New York or the doors of Capitol Hill are opening, that we're not raising the full gamut, that we are making compromises, whether consciously or subconsciously. And the trick to me that has worked as far as I know, and I have tried on a policy level, is to bring up, let's talk about the 10% of the male population, Palestinian population that was murdered. Let's talk about the slave and the concentration camps in which Palestinians sat. Let's increase the ceiling of our narrative and our policies. Let them reject, and we continue. So I hope that that's a clarification, but on all fronts, always.
Excellent. I'm not too optimistic that America will ever change because I mean, I can't remember any time in U.S. history where actually it was on the side of the colonized versus the colonizer. It has always been on the side of the aggressor, especially if the aggressor is European and so on, or Anglo, whatever it is. So I'm not, some things need to be, I guess, encapsulated in an anti-imperialist movement, like we had some in the maybe late 60s, early 70s, and so on, and now has disappeared. And have Palestine as part or a fundamental part of that anti-imperialist movement to have.
Said, do you mind if I interject here very quickly, just to say?
Yes, absolutely. I just want to tell you that we're getting a lot of questions, and I'm going to be reflecting a lot of these questions to you guys before going. Please go ahead.
No, just on that particular point, I'm thinking about every single bit of social progress that has ever been made in this country. It never came as a result of the centers of power deciding that they want to do the right thing. It always came as a result of grassroots pressure that was built that shamed them into being forced to capitulate in the face of really a shifting discourse and a people rising up to demand something that is fundamentally different. So when I think of something like apartheid South Africa, of course the United States was in favor of apartheid, but we created a climate in this country where it was no longer respectable to be in favor of apartheid, to the point to where politicians, for the sake of saving their own skin, felt that they had to take the morally correct position, even if they did not really care ultimately one way or the other. And that's sort of the fundamental reality in the United States, is that politicians are primarily concerned about their short-term political interests in terms of being elected and re-elected and so on. And I think that's, there's endless examples of us reaching a point where you can place enough pressure on them doing the right thing, not necessarily because, US empire believes in doing the right thing on principle, but because it becomes untenable for individuals within the United States who are holding positions of political power to continue heading in the wrong direction.
Just one note, tiny note, Omar, and thank you. And Ustazi Said, and I think that that's a critical point and underscores, I think, what both Michael and Omar have said, because there is a distinction, Omar, between the US investment in South Africa and the US investment in Palestine and in the region. And that makes it harder to shift, which brings us back to the point that Ustazna said, which is imperialism. And until the point where the US is either anti or at least non-imperialist, or whatever new formulation they're going to come up with for dominating the region, because that's not going to end at any point so long as imperialism is within the realm of interest for the US. That's not going to happen. So I do second that it will be a very long time before we would ever see change come from the US. And really, as everybody else has said, it doesn't, you can't convince the people who are the cause of the colonization and the oppression to be the ones you can't convince your colonizer, basically.
No. Okay. The two things that happened this week, I just want to throw it your way, which is the letter that you spoke about that was signed on by 125 Democratic members of the House, which is demanding that no, don't link U.S. aid to Israel, military aid to Israel, to it's a humanitarian abuses of humanitarian rights of the Palestinian. But at least 100 Democrats did not sign on to it. So that's great. I mean, that would have been in the past. All 435 members. This time around we had 337 members sign this letter. And the other thing is, a new lobbying shop, a new Israeli lobbying shop is springing up in town. Kushner, none other than Jared Kushner, is establishing a foundation for normalization. He's calling it the Abraham Accord, organized foundation, whatever it is. And on that issue, Michael, I have a specific question for you from our chairman, Dr. Subhi Ali. What is, how do you see, please comment on Biden and the Abraham Accord. I mean, his treatment. By the way, he spoke with the Emirati Crown Prince a couple of days ago and told him, right on, go on, normalization is great. So go ahead.
Yeah, this is really interesting because I think quietly, many Democrats have basically implied or outright said that they agree with what the Trump administration did in that case, and other agreements throughout the region. And now we have this, as you mentioned, I think it's called the Abraham Accords Institute, which is being started by foundation to promote tourism and trade between the countries, or however many. And he's pretty explicit. In that first report, they said that they were openly trying to get more Democratic donors or Democratic people involved with the board. Blinken, I think he was questioned by the House Judiciary Committee a few weeks ago and was asked if he thought that Pompeo had done anything good during his time as Secretary of State. The first thing he identified was the Abraham Accords. I think it's interesting because I may have mentioned this already, but part of that was obviously giving the UAE $23 billion in weapons, Predator drones, F-35s, which the Trump administration negotiated. And then there was some hope, I guess, or pressure on Biden to stop it from happening. But of course, he greenlit it, I think, a couple months ago in April. And that announcement, that came a couple months after he said, of course, that he wanted to end U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's war on Yemen, the details of which I think many people are still waiting for what that means. But of course, the UAE has been instrumental in helping to destroy Yemen, and have been involved in that campaign from the beginning. So here on one hand we have Biden throughout the campaign saying, I want to end the war in Yemen. It's a horrible thing. I want to pull away from supporting Saudi Arabia, and yet he greenlights this Trump plan to give a country that's helped destroy Yemen billions of dollars in weapons. So I think that's something to pay attention to going forward. And that first report where we first learned that Biden supported the Abraham, or his administration would support them and do nothing to roll them back, it was reported that this was obviously, they thought it was important in an attempt to curry favor with Netanyahu. So this is just all kind of maybe geopolitical strategy from their vantage point, but I don't think it gets talked about nearly enough. How not just Biden, but how many Democrats have come out and support or effectively support Trump when it comes to those deals, and how many have not criticized them.
Well, my 2 cents worth on the accords. There's a lot of cynicism involved in these accords. I mean, the Abraham Accord, the normalization. And I don't know what they call the Abrahamic Accords, but these normalizations effort, after all, you mentioned UAE is getting the F-35 as if it will ever use them for self-defense. I mean, that is not likely. That is just to grease the military-industrial complex, and for Sudan, it was lifted. It was blackmail, plain and simple. We take you off the terror list if you do this. And with Morocco, it was the Western Sahara. So I mean, Bahrain maybe went along for the ride. I don't know, but so these are very cynical things. I have a question to any of you from one of our listeners and viewers, and says, do you see? Do you see hope? Is there a point in Palestinian efforts to influence Israeli public opinion? Do you see any benefit for Palestinians in engaging with the Israelis to move the needle in Israel?
This is not my, Israeli society is not my area of expertise. I often say and tweet that it's actually an aspect of our struggle that we don't study enough. And there's a reason that it's so hard to access information, really. And the Israeli government is so invested in keeping analyses and studies of Israeli society and Israeli identities, actually. For those of us who've done investigations, very under wraps and undercover. But I think that what we're seeing on the street in Palestine 48, aka Israeli territory, from the settlers and so on and so forth, the approval ratings, the 90, the withering away of all of the quote unquote internal issues and corruption in Israeli society, and the convening of the vast majority of the Israeli voting public in support of the platform to liquidate the Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, I think speaks volumes. But I'll let somebody else address this. I just wanted to add 2 points, if I may, Said. Number one is that as we're talking about normalization, it leaves me wondering, and maybe actually this is relevant for the Arab Israeli Jews in the 1948 territories, as well as the Emiratis that are, hanging out on the streets of Haifa and Jaffa and taking photographs of how they feel about the Israeli chant of death to Arab, right? Of death to the Arabs. Okay, UAE, this is what you want to normalize and take a vacation in. The Iraqi Israelis, the Yemeni Israeli Jewish people, many of whom were forced into Palestinian land. This is bound to create rifts, and I'm sure it does, especially as Israeli Jewish people from Iraqi and Arab origin are increasingly being open about their Arabic origins and about their Arabic culture. And that's a note. And I want to bring it back to the normalization. One thing I'd like people to take away from the normalization project, the Abraham Accords and otherwise, and of course, on one level, as Palestinians, as people committed or invested in the Palestinian liberation struggle, we've always had to say, or we were treated as conspiracy theorists when we talked about the coordination and normalization and support between the Arab Peninsula or other Arab governments and the Israeli government and Israeli expansion. And yes, it's great that now we could name it and shame it, especially as these regimes are fascist, these governments are fascist and undemocratic and repressive. But there is, aside from the obvious detriment, there is also a detriment to the Palestinian resistance organizations and to the capacity to receive material aid for preemptive self-defense by Palestinians. As much as we can talk, and we should talk and analyze and critique, and as I do, the Saudi government and even the Emirati, there were moments where there was, this material flow of resources for preemptive aid, and the Palestinian resistance has always depended on forces outside of Palestine, including Palestinian forces outside of Palestine, for resources. And those representatives, these outside representatives of Palestinian political parties who supported Palestinian abilities to be self-sustained, relied on refuge in the countries that are now normalizing. And this is a huge threat, number one. Number two, this needs to come on the radar of those who are advocating in an honest, direct, unapologetic way that our ability to, let's say BDS or end the occupation relies on our ability and the ability of our families to physically survive, and therefore the right to preemptively defend has to be normalized and something that is brought up regularly in all halls of advocacy.
Yeah, well, I tell you what, I am sure there are progressive Israelis and many who probably look at what is happening and are appalled. And one, not to minimize what happened, let's say in 1982, after the Sabra and Shatila massacres, that, hundreds of thousands, maybe tens of thousands marched against Sharon at the time. But in fact, it's been very few in between as far as them going out, Israelis going out and say, we're appalled, not in our name. I mean, what we're seeing today in Sheikh Jarrah is ethnic cleansing. It's horrible ethnic cleansing. I didn't see dozens or hundreds of Israelis say we should not be doing that, going and demonstrating with the Palestinians and so on to ensure that this is not happening. They didn't go out to the Gaza border when hundreds of Palestinians were being sniped, murdered every day by citizen soldiers. I mean, these guys are citizen soldiers. Many of them have served in the West Bank. They know exactly what's going on. So, I'd like to see more, of course, but at least, reviewing the landscape as it is today, I don't see much happening.
Said, it's honestly even more depressing than that, actually, in the sense that it's not just that these protests are few and far in between that are in support of Palestinians. It's the fact that there has been a drastic shift towards the right in young Israeli public opinion. When you look at the United States, here, young people are much more progressive, and that gives people hope in the United States that the future is heading in the right direction. And in Israeli politics, it's exactly the opposite. Things are drifting in a much more dangerous direction, where a majority of young people oppose equality between Palestinians and Israelis. You have right now the Kahanists, followers of Rabbi Meir Kahane, who essentially was a terrorist. I mean, he founded the JDL, which was considered a terrorist organization even by the US government, who was banned from Israeli politics because of his overt racism and violence. That's how extreme he was. And we live right now in a moment where the Kahanists are back in the Israeli Knesset, allied with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So we are moving in a much more dangerous direction. I don't think that there's anything wrong inherently in dialogue between Palestinians and Israelis, but I think that is often a distraction from the fact that this is ultimately not a cultural misunderstanding. This is an extremely deliberate and attempt to drive people out of their homes in order to take them over. This is a political project that is anti-Palestinian fundamentally, and it's not going to be solved by people getting together and talking and eating hummus together and whatever. This is going to be solved when there is enough political pressure that is brought to bear on Israel to change its behavior. And that's fundamentally where all of the energy ought to be focused. I think things in terms of building cultural understanding between people and all that, it's absolutely great, but it's not worth devoting energy to it when we're at a point right now, especially where public opinion among young Israelis are moving in a really horrifying anti-Palestinian direction. I don't see how there is anything that positive that could fundamentally shift Israeli policy in the short term, in the next 5, 10, or 20 years even, that would come out of these efforts. I think it's critical right now to build on the momentum of the fact that there is this increasing call for accountability for Israeli behavior internationally, whether it's the ICC investigation, whether it's members of Congress calling for conditioning of aid to Israel. That, I think, is where the effort would be much more wisely spent in order to get returns more quickly.
Sorry, just one to build on the last thing that Omar said. What should be very disturbing is that Israel is increasing, is in an increased stage of its incremental genocide at the time where it's being investigated for the ICC. And this speaks to its confidence and indifference, really, to the international community and the commitment of it in its goals of not just ethnic cleansing and not just apartheid, but both of these for the express purpose of genocide.
We're coming towards the end of our session here. It's wonderful. There are so many things to talk about. I just wanted to mention something that Lamis touched upon, which is the Palestinian election. And I think one of the most cynical things, if I may use the term again, by the Palestinian leadership was to say, without Jerusalem, we will not have a vote or have a vote. I mean, as you mentioned, Lamis, voting elections under occupations are, precarious to begin with, not very legitimate. But I think for the Palestinian Authority to say, Jerusalem or no elections and so on, when in fact the election was held in Jerusalem twice and so on. This is an issue that in fact they're recognizing Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem, which I cannot understand. With that, I want to thank you and ask each one of you to give us your concluding statements. We'll begin with Lamis, then Michael, then Omar. Thank you.
So I didn't expect a concluding statement. I do ask that people do more, that we take, that people do more, put more intellectual resources. Just because the genocide of Palestinians is incremental does not mean that we take incremental steps in advancing our struggle for liberation, protection, and return of Palestinians. Thank you so much, Said, Mohammed, Omar, and Michael, for all you do, always and today.
Yeah, I also don't have a concluding statement prepared, but I would just say, the last few weeks, what we've already talked about, we saw the McCollum bill, and then we saw, the letters that we referenced signed by many Democrats, and now we're seeing these horrible, terrifying videos and images of people being violently displaced from their homes. And I hope that, obviously it moves people and, motivates them to, as was just said, agitate all the more harder to stress those contradictions and the need for people to speak out politically and beyond that. But again, thanks so much to Palestine Center for organizing this, and I thought it was a great discussion. Thanks to the panelists as well.
I'm going to try to resist the urge to do the detour into the Palestinian leadership and the elections and all of that, and just focus on a closing statement that addresses the big picture that we're talking about here, which, I would probably say a few things. One, the events in Sheikh Jarrah right now are absolutely outrageous, and I think that we should all raise our voices and highlight what is unfolding, to get in touch with our members of Congress, to tell them that they need to speak up against it, to get in touch with our local media outlets and demand that they cover what's happening. Because again, if this were Israelis who are being brutalized, this absolutely would have been breaking news everywhere. And we need to end this idea that Palestinian suffering is standard and unworthy of attention. I think we need a different, media landscape. And I think that comes from people reaching out and demanding a different coverage for what's happening. I think that all of us should engage in whatever way that we can. I think people have different skills. There are organizers who should organize. There are people who are good at public speaking, who should do more public speaking and media engagements. There are people who, there's a variety of ways to engage on any issue. And I think every person should bother to take the time to look at their situation locally, to see what organizations are active on this issue, and to see how they can make themselves most useful in plugging in and trying to help shift the narrative and shift policy on Palestine. There isn't one cookie cutter way to be an activist. There's a million of them, and I think it's important for all of us to engage in as many ways as possible. And the last thing that I'll say is that I think passionate disagreement within this movement is absolutely necessary for the health of the ideas that are being generated within this movement. So I think that internal debate and disagreement, and it can be incredibly passionate and serious, is really critical. But also I think we should be wary of sometimes the level of divisions that happens over strategic disagreements, where people see people who disagree with them as fundamentally being in a way an enemy of the movement. And I think that it's important to slow down a little bit and look at the bigger picture, remember who the enemy is, and the enemy is anybody who supports the apartheid system that currently exists, and anybody who's fighting against it is, in a loose sense, an ally, even when we sometimes disagree on how to fight back against this apartheid system that's afflicting the Palestinian people.
I want to remind everybody that these marauders that are, ethnically cleansing the Palestinians in Sheikh Jarrah are actually supported by American organizations that are 100% tax deductible. I mean, maybe some activism ought to emerge from that point. With that, I want to apologize from anyone that we couldn't get to pose their questions. And I want to thank you, Omar, thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lamis. This has been really very enlightening, and we could talk about these issues for a very long time and not ever finish. So with that, I thank you and turn it over to Mohammed.
Thank you all. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Omar, and thank you, Lamis. And we thank our audience as well for tuning in. And thank you for such a great discussion and insight into the subject. We really appreciate it, and we hope to have you again soon. For the audience that's still watching, you can keep up with what we're doing in the future with future events like this. You can follow us on Twitter at Palestine Center on Instagram, which is the handle is Jerusalem Fund. You can find us on Facebook as well. And you can also watch these videos again on our YouTube channel. And you can find them on our website as well, which is thejerusalemfund.org. Once again, thank you to our speakers.
Thank you.
Thank you to Said, our wonderful moderator. And thank you to the audience for tuning in.
Thank you.
And have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much.